Hello friends, today I will share with you the story of creation of my illustration based on the Warcraft universe that features well-known Jaina Proudmoore. This illustration was created for the art contest dedicated to the games of Blizzard, organized by the digital art school Smirnov School. The task of the contest was to illustrate any story based on the games of the Blizzard Entertainment. I grew up on the games of this company, as probably many of you did, and I played Warcraft when I was in school. Being a huge fan of the fantasy genre, I decided to illustrate the story from the Warcraft universe. The choice of the main character was strongly influenced by the released back then video series named Warbringers. The short cinematic about Jaina made a huge impression on me. The art style, storytelling and music were so amazing, so I decided to choose her as the main character of the illustration. I had a weak knowledge about who exactly Jaina was. I started with a study of her story. I watched several rather long videos on YouTube which explained her story in detail. And frankly, I was amazed at how many terrible events she had to go through. That's why I wanted to show her inner thoughts associated with the loss of the loved ones, instead of any epic scenes, battles, and something that first comes to mind. In fact, she's tormented by thoughts about the correctness of her actions, which, as a result, have led to many tragedies, and now she's questioning everything she believed in her entire life. The idea to portray the inner experience of the character was promising in my mind, so I decided to try to show it in the illustration. Initially, I made a super rough sketch on paper to schematically outline the plot in a given frame. At this stage I did not care at all about the technique, about the quality of the lines. The main task here was to create and store the idea. Sometimes it's useful to write a small text describing what's happening. This will help to create a more thoughtful and deep story, to work out the details before you start drawing. Back then I often used DS Studio to pose the character and determine the camera angle. This program makes it quite easy to put a standard character in a pose, set the camera and set the size of the final frame. At first I thought about drawing her sitting at the table, but decided to scrap this idea because the table overlapped the character by more than a half, which in my case would be a bad artistic decision. I knew that I wanted to add at least 3 more key characters to the scene. All of them were to some extent close to Jaina, and everyone suffered directly or indirectly from her decisions. When I am satisfied with the composition and poses, I usually take a screenshot and begin to draw on top of it in 2D software, but this time I wanted to go a little further and put the whole 3D scene together, along with the characters as well as the environment. That's why in ZBrush I made rough models of the main figures, put them in the right poses taken from the DS Studio. I spent more time on the main character. Secondary ones were sculpted quite roughly, since I knew that I later will redo everything in 2D. I textured Jaina quickly in 3D code to use her model as a reference of lighting and materials in future. Environment was made in 3D code as well, and all of these objects were later combined into one scene in Marmoset. Nowadays I would do it completely differently. These days I prefer to use Blender, since it's possible to make everything in one program and it's fast and efficient. In 3D it's possible to work with framing, lighting, visual effects and so on. I painted this illustration mostly in Krita, which is free, and, in my opinion, is an excellent alternative to Photoshop. When everything was done I saved the render and started drawing line art on top of it. Such renders serve me rather as a guideline on which I base my line art. Personally I don't like to paint on top of 3D, because I don't always manage to get rid of this 3D feel in my work. Therefore, after I finished line art, I hide the layer with the render and use it only as a reference. So this way work turns out to be more consistent, because all parts of the work were painted by hand in similar fashion. I was trying to add details and refine the form while I was doing line art to make it more interesting. However, I didn't refine lines too much, because I knew that in the end I would change a lot. After the drawing was ready, I created a fill layer for each character using the lasso tool or just a brush. It is easier to work later by isolating or masking individual characters or parts of the environment. Next, I drew shading in grayscale on a separate layer. I explained the exact same process in my other tutorial. Make sure to watch it and learn more about my pipeline. I wasn't refining shading too much this time, because I knew that at the render stage I would redo a lot. At this stage the main thing for me was to get a good base to work with. I tried to pay attention to the cast and core shadows, as well as to draw the ambient occlusion. I drew all shading in one layer per character, however in some cases you can draw separately cast shadow and ambient occlusion. This is convenient when you compile a picture from separate layers, such as shadows, highlights, reflected lights, base color and so on. In this illustration my line art was not final, and I knew that at the stage of rendering I would correct a lot, so I didn't spend too much time working on the shading in order to save some time. When shading was done, I added a layer with a base color under the shading layer, which I applied using multiply blending mode. Sometimes it's useful to tint the shading with some color, to give the picture more vibrant colors. Once the shading and color are ready, you can merge the layers for each character and start rendering. Before painting, I decided to make the scene more gloomy and sad, so I reduced the saturation and warmth of the color. It seemed to me more appropriate for the story I was trying to tell. During rendering, you need to constantly pay attention to the rhythms and volumes of the forms that you paint. Many times I reworked quite large parts of the illustration, because of the repetition of the rhythms or sizes or angles of the forms. Rhythmic and contrastive forms are very important in any artwork. Among other things, you should pay attention to the points of contact, a place where one object is in contact with another one. In such places, objects usually reflect light onto each other, and therefore it's good to mix their colors into each other, so they belong to the same environment. In the course of the work I decided to add more objects to the foreground, to enhance the feeling of depth. To do this, I quickly made a model of the table and several household items in 3D code and added to the finished scene, obtaining an interesting shape and silhouette in the foreground. Having a scene in 3D with the camera is very convenient, because you do not need to think about perspective anymore, but simply work on the position of the object in the frame and 3D space, knowing that they are in the right angle, in perspective, of the right scale and height relative to the character. This frees up time and energy to work on the more important details such as the story. In the process, I put the pen aside many times and just looked at the work, making notes about those parts which I didn't like. At such moments I try to be absolutely objective and write down everything that I don't like. This helps to look at the work not as an artist who pays attention to the technical details, but as a spectator. I advise you to do this several times in the process of creating an illustration. It is also sometimes useful to put the work aside for several days, and then after this time you are guaranteed to look at this with fresh eyes. Or you can ask someone for an opinion. For example, your colleagues or close friends may help you to see some mistakes. Do not hesitate and do not neglect this, because they can give you a lot of useful ideas and point at the things that you as a creator of the work are no longer paying attention to. Here are some examples of the notes that I did during the process. As you can see, there were quite a few of them. So the rendering continued until I painted over all unfinished places and was more or less satisfied with the result. The last step for me usually is visual effects and color correction. At this stage I added atmospheric effects, light, particles, and also lowered the contrast of the secondary elements and emphasized the important ones. I did the color correction in Photoshop because it's easier and more efficient than in any other software. Krita has the necessary filters or effects, but working with them on high resolutions is quite difficult. After all that, the work can be considered finished, but before you publish it, you can put it aside for a day or two. What if you will find something to fix when you look at it next day? I personally found a great enjoyment in the process of creating this illustration. It was a great opportunity and challenge for me. I think The most challenging part for many of us is finishing the work before the deadline. At some point you may become tired and not inspired anymore, and you may want to abandon the work. In this case, support of your family and friends may be very important. They may encourage you and you will feel motivated again. I hope you learned something new while watching this video, because I learned a lot while I was painting this illustration. Smash the like button and subscribe. Thank you very much for your time. See you later.